The carriage wheel cracked on the frozen road, and Nathaniel Ashwood was thrown against the door with a force that knocked the breath out of him. Outside, the horses screamed and reared, and the driver shouted something lost in the wind. For one long moment Nathaniel believed the carriage would tip into the ravine beside the road, and he gripped the seat with both hands, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. Then the wheel caught on a rock, the carriage steadied, and the horses slowed to a nervous trot. Nathaniel exhaled, adjusted his coat, and stared out at the gray, biting cold of the countryside, wondering if the accident was some kind of omen for the journey he did not want to make. He was the Duke of Camden, though he had never asked to be. The title had come to him 2 years earlier, when his father died suddenly of a fever that no physician could explain, leaving Nathaniel, then only 26, to manage an estate heavy with debt, tenants who depended on him, and a grandmother who believed that duty was the only language worth speaking. He had spent those 2 years buried in ledgers, riding out to inspect failing fields, and negotiating with bankers who looked at him the way wolves look at wounded deer. He had not had time for courtship, and if he was honest with himself, he had not wanted it either. But his grandmother, the Dowager Duchess Beatrix, did not care what he wanted. Her letter had arrived 3 weeks earlier, delivered by a rider who had ridden through the night to reach him. Nathaniel could still remember the words, sharp and final, written in her steady hand. "You will marry within the year, or the name of Ashwood will die with you. I have already spoken with Lord Pembroke. He has 3 daughters, each suitable, each waiting. You will visit his estate and you will choose one. This is not a request." Nathaniel had read the letter twice, then set it down and stared at the fire for a long while. He was not a man who enjoyed being told what to do, but he loved his grandmother, and he understood, in the cold, practical way he understood most things, that she was right. The estate needed an heir. The family needed stability. And so, 3 weeks later, here he was, rattling along a frozen road toward Pembroke Hall, toward 3 sisters he had never met, expected to choose a wife the way a man might choose a horse at market. The carriage rounded a bend, and the house came into view. Pembroke Hall was grand in the way old houses are grand, with tall windows glowing gold against the darkening sky and ivy creeping up its stone walls like it had grown there for centuries, because it had. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys. Somewhere beyond the gates, dogs were barking at the sound of approaching wheels. Nathaniel felt his stomach tighten. He did not know why. He had faced angry tenants, furious creditors, and a grandmother whose disappointment could freeze a room. Yet the thought of walking into that house, and being presented to 3 young women like a prize to be won made something in him recoil. The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door and cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of wood smoke and wet earth. Nathaniel stepped down, straightened his coat, and looked up at the house that would, if his grandmother had her way, soon hold his future wife. Lord Pembroke himself came out to greet him, a stout man with a booming voice and a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He clasped Nathaniel's hand with both of his own, pumping it enthusiastically. "Your Grace," he said, "the honor is entirely ours. My daughters have spoken of nothing else for weeks." Nathaniel offered a polite smile, the kind he had practiced in mirrors during long nights when sleep would not come. "I am grateful for your hospitality, Lord Pembroke," he said. "The road here was not kind to my carriage wheel." Pembroke laughed too loudly at that, the kind of laugh men gave when they were nervous or eager to please, and Nathaniel filed the observation away without quite knowing why it mattered. They walked together toward the entrance, and Nathaniel caught sight of movement in one of the tall windows, a curtain shifting, a pale face disappearing quickly from view. Someone had been watching for his arrival. He supposed that should not have surprised him. Inside, the house was warm, almost oppressively so after the cold of the road, and smelled of beeswax candles and roasting meat. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the hallway, watching Nathaniel pass with painted eyes that seemed to judge him for arriving late, for arriving reluctant, for arriving at all. "Come," Pembroke said, gesturing him toward a set of double doors at the end of the hall. "My daughters are eager to meet you." Nathaniel felt his jaw tighten just slightly, before he mastered his expression again. He thought of his grandmother's letter, of the word choose, as if a woman's whole future and his own could be decided the way one decided between 3 bolts of cloth at a tailor's shop. He did not like it. But he had come this far, and turning back now would only bring shame to his family and disappointment to the grandmother. He loved more than he let himself admit. The doors opened, and the drawing room beyond was bright with candlelight and full of expectant silence. 3 young women stood in a careful arrangement near the fireplace, as though they had been posed there by an artist rather than allowed to simply exist in the room. Nathaniel took them in with the quick, assessing glance he had learned to use when inspecting horses or negotiating contracts, though he felt a flicker of shame for thinking of them that way even for a moment. The eldest, tall and sharp-featured, watched him with calculating eyes, her chin lifted slightly, as though she had already decided the outcome of the evening and was simply waiting for the rest of them to catch up. The middle sister was softer in appearance, delicate, her hands folded neatly in front of her gaze flicking nervously between her father and the Duke, clearly desperate to please. And the youngest stood slightly apart from the other 2, arms crossed loosely, an expression on her face that Nathaniel could only describe as barely concealed irritation, as though she would rather be anywhere else in the world. "Your Grace," Pembroke announced, his voice booming with pride, "may I present my daughters? Charlotte my eldest, Margaret my second, and Isla my youngest." Each young woman offered a curtsy in turn. Charlotte's was precise and elegant, practiced 1,000 times. Margaret's was quick and a little too eager, her eyes darting up to check Nathaniel's reaction before she had even fully risen. Isla's curtsy was the briefest of the 3, almost careless, and Nathaniel caught the faintest roll of her eyes before she composed her face into something more suitable. He found himself, despite everything, almost smiling. "Your Grace," Charlotte said, stepping forward smoothly, "we are so pleased you have come. The journey from Camden is a long one, I understand. You must be tired." Her voice was pleasant, well modulated, the voice of someone who had rehearsed every possible topic of conversation a duke might wish to discuss. Nathaniel answered politely, something about the roads and the weather, and watched as Charlotte guided the conversation exactly where she wanted it to go, asking about his estate, his interests, his preferences for the evening meal, each question calculated to make her seem attentive and accomplished. Margaret, for her part, said very little, though she watched Nathaniel with wide, hopeful eyes every time he spoke, as though hanging on each word for some sign of approval. When he complimented the room's decoration, she flushed with pleasure and thanked him 3 times before her mother's sharp glance from across the room silenced her. Isla said almost nothing at all. She stood near the window, occasionally glancing outside at the darkening gardens, and only answered directly when a question was aimed squarely at her. When Pembroke asked her to describe her recent needlework to the Duke, she gave a short, flat answer and then fell silent again, clearly uninterested in performing for his benefit. Nathaniel found the whole scene exhausting in a way he had not expected. He had imagined awkwardness, certainly, and perhaps some nerves on all sides, but he had not imagined the sheer effort of it, the way every word in the room felt weighed and measured, the way even silence seemed to carry expectation. Tea was brought in not long after, carried on a heavy silver tray by a young woman in a plain gray dress, her dark hair pulled back neatly beneath a simple cap. Nathaniel barely noticed her at first, his attention still caught on Charlotte's continuing stream of polished conversation, but something made him glance toward the tea tray as it was set down on the low table between them. The young woman moved with quiet efficiency, pouring tea into delicate cups without spilling a drop, her hands steady despite the number of eyes in the room, though none of those eyes seemed to be on her. She served Lord Pembroke first, then his wife, then Charlotte, moving around the room in careful order, her expression calm and unreadable, the kind of expression Nathaniel recognized from long practice in his own household, the expression of someone who had learned to be present without being seen. When she reached Margaret, the girl thanked her softly, and the servant offered the smallest hint of a smile in return, gone as quickly as it appeared. Then she reached Isla. "Thank you, Eliza," Isla murmured, and something in her tone was different, warmer, more genuine than anything Nathaniel had heard from any of the sisters all evening. The servant, Eliza, gave a small nod, and for just a moment something passed between the two young women, some private understanding that had nothing to do with the room full of watching eyes. Nathaniel found himself curious, despite his best efforts not to be. When Eliza reached him, she poured his tea with the same careful precision she had shown the others, her eyes lowered respectfully, her manner perfectly correct. But as she set the cup down before him, Charlotte, seated nearby, made some comment about the poor quality of tea leaves available in the countryside these days, comparing them unfavorably to what one could find in London, and Nathaniel caught, just barely, the faintest tightening around Eliza's mouth, a flicker of something suppressed, quickly hidden behind her calm expression as she straightened and stepped back from the table. It was such a small thing. He should not have noticed it at all. But he did, and it lingered with him in a way Charlotte's carefully constructed compliments did not. "Your Grace," Charlotte said, drawing his attention back to her with a bright smile, "you must tell us about Camden. I have heard the gardens there are magnificent." Nathaniel answered as politely as he could manage, though his gaze drifted, without his permission, toward the corner of the room where Eliza had retreated, standing quietly near the sideboard, waiting to be needed again, her eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, as though she had trained herself not to look at anyone directly unless spoken to. He wondered briefly who she was. A servant, clearly, from her dress and her position in the room, yet there was something in the way Isla had spoken her name, something familiar rather than formal, that made Nathaniel think there was more to the story than a simple mistress and maid arrangement. The evening wore on. Charlotte talked, Margaret smiled and agreed with everything her father and sister said, and Isla grew visibly more restless as the hours passed, glancing toward the window more than once as though calculating how soon she might reasonably be permitted to leave. Nathaniel answered questions, offered polite observations about the house and the weather and the state of the roads, and felt, with every passing minute, more and more like an actor in a play whose script he had never been given. At one point, Lady Pembroke, a thin woman with sharp eyes much like her eldest daughter's, leaned toward her husband and murmured something Nathaniel could not hear, though he caught Charlotte's name in the whisper, and watched as Pembroke nodded approvingly, glancing at Nathaniel with the satisfied look of a man who believed the matter was already settled. Nathaniel felt a flicker of irritation at that. He was not a prize to be claimed. He was not even certain, watching Charlotte's practiced smile and Margaret's anxious eagerness, that he wanted to be here at all. When the tea things were finally cleared away, it was Eliza who returned to collect the tray, moving quietly around the room once more, gathering cups with careful hands. As she reached Nathaniel's chair, he found himself, without quite deciding to, speaking to her directly. "Thank you," he said, "the tea was very good." It was such a small thing to say, hardly worth remarking on, yet the room seemed to still for a moment, as though a duke thanking a servant directly was an unusual enough occurrence to draw attention. Eliza glanced up, clearly startled, her eyes meeting his for the first time that evening. They were a deep, warm brown, and for just a moment Nathaniel saw something flicker there, surprise, perhaps, or wariness, before she lowered her gaze again and offered a quiet, correct response. "You are very welcome, Your Grace," she said, and then she was gone, the tray balanced carefully in her hands, disappearing through the door at the far end of the room. Charlotte laughed lightly, breaking the strange little silence that had settled over the group. "How kind of you, Your Grace," she said, though something in her tone suggested she found the gesture faintly amusing, perhaps even beneath his notice. Most gentlemen never think to thank the staff at all. Nathaniel said nothing to that, only offered a small, non-committal smile, though inwardly he found himself thinking that perhaps that was exactly the problem. Later that night, alone in the guest chamber prepared for him, a fire crackling in the hearth and the house settling into silence around him, Nathaniel sat by the window and stared out at the dark shapes of the garden below. He thought of his grandmother's letter, of the word choose, of Charlotte's polished conversation, and Margaret's anxious smiles and Isla's barely hidden boredom. He thought, too, though he tried not to dwell on it, of a pair of warm brown eyes meeting his for just a moment before looking quickly away. He did not know, sitting there in the quiet of that unfamiliar room, that the choice his grandmother had demanded of him would not be nearly as simple as she believed, or that the woman who would matter most in the weeks to come was not one of the three sisters waiting so carefully in that drawing room, but the quiet young woman who had poured his tea and then vanished, as she had clearly been trained to do, back into the shadows of a house that did not see her at all. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes, and somewhere in the depths of the great house, a door closed softly. Nathaniel closed his eyes, exhausted from the journey and the strange, performative evening, and told himself that tomorrow he would begin the task his grandmother had set him, that he would observe the three sisters carefully, weigh their merits as he had been instructed, and make the sensible, dutiful choice expected of him. He did not yet know how wrong that plan would go, or how quickly the quiet servant girl with the warm brown eyes would become impossible to ignore. The next morning arrived gray and damp, mist curling low over the gardens of Pembroke Hall, and Nathaniel woke early, long before the household stirred, a habit formed from years of managing an estate that did not run itself. He dressed quietly and made his way downstairs, hoping to find a few moments of solitude before the day's carefully arranged activities began. Activities his grandmother had, no doubt, discussed at length with Lord Pembroke in the letters that had passed between them over the preceding weeks. He found, instead, the beginning of everything that would change the course of his life. Nathaniel stepped out through a side door near the kitchens, drawn by the smell of fresh bread and the sound of low voices, and found himself in a small stone courtyard where the household staff moved briskly about their morning tasks. He had not meant to wander so far from the guest wing, but something about the busy, unpretentious energy of the courtyard felt more honest than anything he had encountered in the drawing room the night before, and he found himself lingering near the doorway, unwilling to interrupt yet unwilling to leave. It was there that he saw Eliza again. She was crouched near a low wooden crate, sorting through winter vegetables with quick, practiced hands, her sleeves rolled up despite the cold, her breath fogging in the morning air. She had not noticed him yet, and for a moment Nathaniel simply watched her work, struck by how different she seemed out here than she had in the drawing room the night before. There she had been careful, contained, every movement measured to draw as little attention as possible. Here, she moved with an ease that suggested this courtyard, this quiet work, was where she felt most herself. A younger girl, perhaps a kitchen maid, called out to her from across the yard, asking a question Nathaniel could not quite hear, and Eliza laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, bright and warm, so unlike the careful stillness she had shown him the evening before that Nathaniel found himself smiling without meaning to. Then she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, and the laugh vanished instantly, replaced by the same careful composure he remembered from the tea tray. "Your Grace," she said, rising quickly and offering a hurried curtsy, her cheeks coloring. "I did not know anyone was awake yet. Forgive me, I should not have been laughing so loudly." "There is nothing to forgive," Nathaniel said, surprised by how quickly he wanted to put her at ease, though he was not entirely sure why it mattered so much to him. "I only came out for some air. Please continue your work. I did not mean to disturb you." She hesitated, clearly uncertain whether it was proper to simply return to her task with a duke standing nearby, and Nathaniel, sensing her discomfort, took a step further into the courtyard, gesturing vaguely toward the crates of vegetables. "I confess I know very little about vegetables," he said, attempting something like humor, though it felt clumsy coming out of his mouth. "My steward manages such things at Camden. I have never once sorted a turnip in my life." To his relief, something in her expression softened, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite her obvious effort to remain composed. "Then you are missing very little, Your Grace," she said. "It is not a skill that impresses many people at dinner parties." "I do not know," Nathaniel said. "I imagine it would impress me a great deal more than most conversation I have endured at dinner parties." Eliza's eyes flicked up to his, surprise flashing across her face at the boldness of the remark, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then she looked away, busying herself once more with the crate of vegetables, though Nathaniel noticed the faint blush that had crept up her neck. "You should not say such things," she said quietly, not unkindly, but with a note of genuine caution in her voice. "Someone might hear." "And what would they think if they did?" Nathaniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Eliza glanced toward the kitchen door, where the sounds of the household staff going about their morning work continued uninterrupted, and lowered her voice further. "They would think a duke was wasting his time speaking with a servant, when he ought to be preparing to meet the young ladies of the house," she said, "and they would not be wrong to think it." Nathaniel considered this for a moment, watching her return to her sorting, her hands quick and sure despite the cold. "I have already met the young ladies of the house," he said finally. "I met them at great length last night, and I expect I will meet them again at great length today, and tomorrow, and every day until this visit concludes. I do not think 5 more minutes in a vegetable courtyard will alter my grandmother's plans significantly." That drew a small laugh from her, quickly suppressed, though Nathaniel counted it a victory all the same. "You are not at all what I expected," she said, then seemed to catch herself, her expression flickering with alarm as though she had said something she should not have. "What did you expect?" Nathaniel asked, genuinely curious now. Eliza hesitated, glancing at him sideways as she straightened a crate of carrots. "Someone more like your carriage," she said finally. Grand and important, and entirely too busy to notice a servant crouched in the cold sorting vegetables. Nathaniel laughed at that, a real laugh, surprising himself with how easily it came. "My carriage lost a wheel on the road here," he said. "It is entirely possible I am not as grand as you assumed." They fell into an easy, unhurried conversation after that, Eliza continuing her work while Nathaniel leaned against the low stone wall of the courtyard, asking questions about the household, about the vegetables, about anything at all that might keep the conversation going a little longer. He learned that she rose before dawn every day, that she managed the tea service because she had steady hands and a good memory for who preferred sugar and who did not, and that she had a fondness for the garden roses that bloomed along the south wall each summer, though she rarely had time to sit and enjoy them. He did not ask, that first morning, how she had come to be a servant in a house that shared her surname with none of its family, though the question hovered at the edge of his mind. There was something in the careful way she spoke about the Pembroke family, a precision that suggested old wounds carefully managed, and Nathaniel, sensing the fragility of the moment, chose not to press. Eventually, the sound of a bell ringing somewhere inside the house signaled that the family was beginning to stir, and Eliza rose quickly, brushing dirt from her apron, her earlier ease replaced once more by careful composure. "I must go, Your Grace," she said. "Breakfast will be wanted soon, and I am needed inside." "Of course," Nathaniel said, though he found himself reluctant to let the conversation end. "Thank you for tolerating my questions about turnips." She smiled at that, a real smile, brief but genuine, before gathering her crates and hurrying toward the kitchen door. Nathaniel watched her go, then remained in the courtyard a moment longer, turning the strange lightness in his chest over in his mind, uncertain what to make of it. Breakfast, when it came, was every bit as performative as the previous evening's tea had been. Charlotte guided the conversation with practiced skill, asking about his preferences for the day's activities, suggesting a walk through the gardens once the mist cleared, mentioning, with careful casualness, that she had recently taken up watercolor painting and would be delighted to show him her work sometime during his visit. Margaret ate quietly, occasionally offering an agreeing nod or a soft laugh at her sister's remarks, though Nathaniel noticed her attention drift more than once toward the window, as though she would rather be looking at the garden than at him. Isla, for her part, arrived late, offered a brief apology that did not sound especially sincere, and spent most of the meal picking at her food, while her mother shot increasingly pointed looks in her direction. It was Eliza who came in partway through the meal to refill the teapot, and Nathaniel found his attention drawn to her despite his best efforts to focus on Charlotte's continuing conversation. She moved through the room with the same quiet efficiency as before, refilling cups, clearing an empty plate, adjusting a chair that had been left askew, never drawing attention to herself. Yet somehow the room felt different to Nathaniel whenever she was in it, as though a quiet, steady presence had entered that made everything else feel slightly less exhausting. "Your Grace," Charlotte said, drawing his attention back with a note of gentle insistence, "you have not answered my question. Would you care to walk the gardens with us this morning, once the mist has cleared?" Nathaniel forced his attention fully back to her, offering what he hoped was a convincing smile. "That sounds very pleasant," he said. "I would be glad to." He caught, from the corner of his eye, the faintest glance Eliza sent his way as she straightened near the sideboard, gone so quickly he could not be certain he had not imagined it, before she gathered the empty teapot and slipped quietly from the room. The garden walk, when it finally happened, proved every bit as carefully orchestrated as Nathaniel had feared. Charlotte walked beside him for most of the route, pointing out the various flower beds and hedgerows with practiced enthusiasm, occasionally steering the conversation toward topics she clearly believed would impress him: her family's connections in London, her fluency in French, her skill at the pianoforte. Margaret trailed a few steps behind, occasionally offering a soft comment when directly addressed, though she seemed far more interested in the pale winter roses along the garden wall than in the conversation happening around her. Isla, true to form, wandered off entirely at one point, claiming a sudden interest in the greenhouse, leaving her mother to send an irritated servant scurrying after her. Nathaniel found himself, throughout the walk, thinking not of Charlotte's practiced charm or Margaret's quiet gentleness or even Isla's stubborn independence, but of a courtyard full of winter vegetables and a laugh that had rung out clear and unguarded before catching itself and falling silent. That evening at dinner, Lord Pembroke made a point of seating Nathaniel between Charlotte and Margaret, an arrangement so obviously intentional that Nathaniel nearly laughed aloud at the transparency of it. Isla sat across the table, occasionally catching Nathaniel's eye with an expression that suggested she found the entire arrangement as absurd as he did, though neither of them said so aloud. It was during the second course that Nathaniel noticed Eliza again, moving quietly along the edge of the room, refilling wine glasses and removing empty plates with the same careful, practiced efficiency she brought to every task. Lady Pembroke, seated near the head of the table, called out to her at one point, her tone sharp enough that several conversations paused. "Eliza, the wine has gone warm. See that it is properly chilled before you bring it out again." Eliza's expression did not change, though Nathaniel noticed the slight tightening around her eyes as she murmured an apology and hurried from the room with the offending bottle. He felt a flash of irritation on her behalf, quickly suppressed, reminding himself that it was not his place to comment on the running of another household, however uncomfortable it made him feel to witness it. Charlotte, seated beside him, seemed not to notice the exchange at all, continuing her conversation about a recent visit to London without pause. Margaret, on his other side, glanced briefly toward the door where Eliza had disappeared, her expression difficult to read, before returning her attention to her plate. It was Isla, from across the table, who finally spoke, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry over the general conversation. "You needn't speak to her that way, Mother," she said. "The wine was fine." Lady Pembroke's expression sharpened instantly. "Isla, that is quite enough," she said. "This is not the time or place." Isla's jaw tightened, but she said nothing further, returning her attention to her plate with the same barely restrained irritation Nathaniel had noticed the previous evening. He found himself, for the first time since arriving, feeling a flicker of genuine respect for the youngest sister, even as he remained certain that whatever affection Isla felt toward Eliza, it was not the kind of connection his grandmother had sent him here to find. When Eliza returned with the properly chilled wine, her expression was as composed as ever, betraying nothing of whatever had passed between her and Lady Pembroke in the kitchen. She poured Nathaniel's glass with steady hands, and as she did, he found himself speaking again, quietly, meant only for her. "Thank you," he said, the same simple words he had offered the previous evening. She glanced up at him briefly, something unreadable flickering behind her eyes, before offering the same careful, correct response as before. "You are very welcome, Your Grace." But this time, as she straightened and moved on to the next glass, Nathaniel thought he saw, just for a moment, the ghost of the smile she had given him in the courtyard that morning. He spent the rest of the dinner only half attending to Charlotte's conversation, his mind returning again and again to the quiet dignity with which Eliza had endured Lady Pembroke's sharp words, to the flicker of gratitude in her eyes when he had thanked her, to the strange, growing certainty that whatever his grandmother believed she had arranged for him at Pembroke Hall, it was not going to unfold the way anyone expected. Later, as the household settled for the night and Nathaniel made his way up the darkened staircase toward his chamber, he passed a narrow servants' corridor and heard, faintly, two voices speaking low. He recognized one of them immediately as Eliza's, and though he knew he should continue on toward his room without pausing, he found himself slowing his steps just enough to catch a few words carried on the quiet air. "He is kind," one voice said, and Nathaniel's chest tightened at the recognition that the voice belonged to Eliza. "Kinder than I expected. But it does not matter, Rose. He is here to choose one of them, not me. I would do well to remember that." The other voice, presumably the kitchen maid he had glimpsed that morning, murmured something too soft to make out, and then footsteps moved away, and the corridor fell silent again. Nathaniel stood alone in the dark hallway for a long moment, turning her words over in his mind, feeling something settle in his chest that felt very much like the beginning of trouble, and finding, despite every instinct toward duty and sense that told him he should walk on and forget what he had heard, that he could not quite make himself want to forget it at all. 3 days into his visit, Lord Pembroke announced, with the enthusiasm of a man who believed he was offering a great gift, that the household would spend the afternoon at a hunting party arranged in Nathaniel's honor, followed by a picnic luncheon in the eastern meadow, weather permitting. Nathaniel, who had little enthusiasm for hunting, and even less for the prospect of another afternoon spent fending off Charlotte's carefully constructed conversation, agreed with as much grace as he could manage, if only because refusing would have caused more difficulty than accepting. The morning of the hunt dawned clear and cold, a rare break in the gray weather that had followed him since his arrival, and the household gathered in the stable yard amid a great deal of noise and bustle. Grooms led out horses saddled and ready, dogs strained at their leashes with excited barking, and Lord Pembroke moved among his guests with the booming good cheer of a man thoroughly enjoying his role as host. Charlotte appeared in a riding habit clearly chosen with great care, deep green wool that flattered her figure and complemented her dark hair, and she made her way directly to Nathaniel's side before he had even finished checking his horse's girth. "I do hope you will ride beside me this morning, Your Grace," she said, her smile bright and practiced. "I have hunted these grounds since I was a girl. I could point out the best paths if you would find that helpful." Nathaniel murmured something noncommittal, aware that refusing outright would seem unnecessarily rude, though he found himself already dreading the prospect of an entire morning spent listening to Charlotte narrate the landscape with the same polished enthusiasm she brought to every conversation. Margaret, for her part, did not ride at all, claiming a headache that kept her confined to the house, though Nathaniel suspected, from the relieved look on her face as the hunting party departed, that the headache was rather more convenient than genuine. Isla rode, but kept well to the rear of the group, her horse ambling along at a pace that suggested she had no more interest in the hunt than Nathaniel did, though she seemed considerably more comfortable with her own disinterest than he felt with his. The morning passed in a blur of thundering hooves and baying dogs and Charlotte's continuous, cheerful commentary, and Nathaniel found his attention wandering, again and again, back toward the house they had left behind, toward the quiet courtyard where he had spent those unexpected minutes among crates of winter vegetables. It was not until the party paused near a stream to water the horses that Nathaniel finally found a moment of relative solitude, stepping away from the group under the pretense of stretching his legs after the long ride. He walked a short distance along the bank, grateful for the quiet, and it was there, quite unexpectedly, that he encountered Eliza again. She was crouched near the water's edge, filling a large jug, apparently sent ahead by the kitchen to prepare for the midday meal that would follow the hunt. She startled slightly when she noticed him approaching, rising quickly and offering the same careful curtsy she always gave him. "Your Grace," she said, "forgive me, I did not expect anyone to come this way." "I seem to have a habit of interrupting your work," Nathaniel said, offering a small smile. "First vegetables, now water. I promise I am not following you on purpose." A flicker of amusement crossed her face, quickly suppressed. "I would not presume to suggest such a thing, Your Grace," she said, though her tone carried a note of gentle teasing that told him she did not entirely believe her own words. He helped her lift the heavy jug, an act that clearly surprised her, judging by the wide-eyed glance she gave him before murmuring a quiet thank you, and they walked together back toward the small cart waiting to carry the picnic supplies to the meadow, an easy silence settling between them that felt, to Nathaniel, more comfortable than any conversation he had shared with Charlotte in 3 full days. "May I ask you something?" he said finally as they walked, and he felt her tense slightly beside him, though she nodded for him to continue. "How long have you lived at Pembroke Hall?" Eliza was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. "Since I was 12, she said finally. "My father was Lord Pembroke's cousin, a distant one but a cousin all the same. When my parents died, there was no one else to take me in, and Lord Pembroke, to his credit, did not turn me away." Nathaniel absorbed this information carefully, feeling something settle uncomfortably in his chest. "But you are family," he said slowly, "not merely staff." Eliza's laugh, when it came, held little humor. "I am family in the sense that I share a distant name with them," she said. "But I have earned my place in this house through work, not through blood that anyone chooses to acknowledge. Lady Pembroke made that clear to me many years ago, and I have found it easier, over time, to simply accept the arrangement than to resent it." "That does not seem right," Nathaniel said, more sharply than he intended, and Eliza glanced at him in surprise. "It is not my place to say whether it is right or wrong, Your Grace," she said carefully. "It is simply the way things are. I have a roof over my head and food to eat, and I am grateful for that, whatever the terms." Nathaniel wanted to argue further, wanted to say that gratitude should not require a person to disappear into the background of their own family's house, pouring tea for cousins who would never think to invite her to sit among them. But he sensed, from the careful set of her shoulders, that pressing the matter further would only cause her discomfort, and so he let the subject drop, though it lingered in his mind for the remainder of the day. They reached the cart, and Eliza set down the jug with practiced care before turning to face him fully for the first time since their conversation began. "You should not spend so much time speaking with me, Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet but earnest. "It will be noticed, and it will not help you with the task your grandmother has sent you here to complete." Nathaniel considered this for a long moment, the sounds of the hunting party drifting faintly through the trees behind them. "Perhaps," he said finally, "I am beginning to think the task my grandmother sent me here to complete is not the one I am most interested in finishing." Eliza's eyes widened slightly at that, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the air between them charged with something neither seemed quite ready to name. Then footsteps approached from the direction of the hunting party, and Eliza stepped back quickly, her expression smoothing into practiced composure just as Charlotte appeared through the trees, her cheeks flushed from riding, her eyes sharp as they took in the scene before her. "There you are, Your Grace," Charlotte said, her voice bright but with an edge Nathaniel had not heard before. "We wondered where you had gone." "I only stepped away to help with the water jug," Nathaniel said easily, though he felt Charlotte's gaze flick pointedly toward Eliza, taking in her flushed cheeks and the careful distance she had put between herself and the Duke, and he suspected, uncomfortably, that Charlotte had seen more than either of them would have liked. "How thoughtful of you," Charlotte said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes as she turned back to Nathaniel, "though I am sure the staff can manage such things without your assistance. Come, The picnic is nearly ready, and Father is asking for you." Nathaniel allowed himself to be led back toward the meadow, though he glanced back once toward Eliza, who had already returned to her work, loading the cart with the same quiet efficiency as always, betraying nothing of the conversation that had passed between them. The picnic itself proved every bit as carefully managed as every other event of his visit. Charlotte positioned herself beside him on the blanket, filling his plate before he had a chance to ask, steering the conversation toward topics designed to showcase her accomplishments, her knowledge of poetry, her fluency in Italian, her plans for redecorating whatever house she might one day preside over. Margaret, having recovered sufficiently from her headache to join the picnic, sat nearby, occasionally offering a soft comment, though her attention seemed increasingly drawn to a young gentleman among Pembroke's other guests, a fact Nathaniel found himself grateful for, if only because it meant one less person he needed to carefully manage his conversation around. Isla, predictably, ate quickly and then wandered off toward the edge of the meadow, claiming an interest in a particular species of wildflower that Nathaniel suspected existed nowhere except in her imagination, though he understood well enough the desire to escape the performative atmosphere of the gathering. It was Lady Pembroke, seated nearby with several other matrons of the neighborhood, who finally broached the subject Nathaniel had been dreading since his arrival. "Your Grace," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the blanket, "we do hope you are finding everything to your satisfaction. My husband tells me your grandmother is most eager for a decision. Might we hope for good news before your visit concludes?" The question landed heavily over the gathering, and Nathaniel felt every eye turned toward him, Charlotte's especially, bright with barely concealed hope. He chose his words carefully, aware of how much weight they would carry. "I have greatly enjoyed my time at Pembroke Hall," he said, which was true enough, though not for the reasons anyone present assumed. "But my grandmother has asked me to make a decision that will affect the rest of my life, and I do not think it wise to rush such a thing, however eager everyone might be for an answer." Lady Pembroke's smile tightened slightly, though she recovered quickly, laughing lightly and turning the conversation toward the quality of the day's weather. But Nathaniel caught Charlotte's expression before she smoothed it into pleasant neutrality, a flash of frustration that told him clearly enough that she had expected by now to have secured his interest firmly enough to make such careful diplomacy unnecessary. The ride back to the house that evening was quiet, the earlier enthusiasm of the hunting party dampened by the long day and the gathering cold. Nathaniel found himself, as the horses picked their way along the darkening path, thinking not of Charlotte's frustration or Lady Pembroke's pointed question, but of Eliza's words beside the stream, of the quiet dignity with which she had described a childhood spent earning her place in a family that shared her blood but not her belonging. That evening, exhausted from the long day, Nathaniel excused himself from the after-dinner gathering earlier than expected, claiming fatigue from the hunt, and made his way toward his chamber through the quiet, candle-lit corridors of the house. He was nearly to his room when he passed the small servants' stairway near the end of the hall and heard, once again, voices carried faintly on the still evening air. This time it was not Eliza he heard, but Lady Pembroke, her voice sharp with irritation, speaking to someone Nathaniel could not immediately identify. "I do not care how tired you are," the voice said. "The Duke's chamber must be prepared properly, and if I hear one more complaint from you about your workload, I will remind you exactly how fortunate you are to have a place in this house at all. You would do well to remember where you would be without our charity." Nathaniel stopped in the shadow of the stairwell, his jaw tightening, certain now who the recipient of this lecture must be, though he could not make out Eliza's response, only the low, careful murmur of someone accustomed to accepting such words without argument. He stood there a long moment after the voices faded, anger simmering quietly in his chest, an anger sharper and more personal than anything he had felt regarding the Pembroke family's treatment of their staff in general. He thought of Eliza's careful composure at the tea tray, her quiet dignity beside the stream, the flash of genuine laughter he had glimpsed that first morning in the courtyard before she had caught herself and hidden it away again, And he found himself, standing alone in that dark corridor, making a decision he had not fully articulated even to himself, though it settled into his chest with the weight and certainty of something he would not easily set aside. Whatever his grandmother had sent him here to find, he was quite certain now that it was not going to be found among the 3 carefully presented sisters waiting for his attention in the drawing room each evening. The following morning, he woke early once more, and made his way, without any pretense of accident, directly toward the kitchen courtyard, where he found Eliza already at work among the winter stores, her breath fogging in the cold morning air, her expression carefully composed despite whatever had passed the previous evening. "Good morning," he said, and watched as she startled, then softened, then, after a brief hesitation, offered him something close to a genuine smile. "You are becoming a very frequent visitor to my turnips, Your Grace," she said, and Nathaniel laughed, the sound surprising him with its ease, and settled in beside her, uncertain exactly where this growing, undeniable pull toward her would lead him, but no longer willing to pretend, even to himself, that it did not exist. By the end of the first week, a pattern had settled quietly into place, one that Nathaniel told himself he was not deliberately arranging, though he could not deny the small ache of anticipation he felt each morning as he made his way toward the kitchen courtyard before the rest of the household stirred. Eliza never seemed entirely surprised to see him anymore, though she still greeted him each time with the same careful mixture of caution and warmth, as though uncertain whether the previous day's ease had been an exception or the beginning of something new. They spoke of small things mostly: the weather, the household's daily rhythms, the various birds that nested along the courtyard wall, and Nathaniel found himself, more than once, laughing more freely in those quiet morning hours than he had in the 2 long years since his father's death had settled the weight of a dukedom onto his shoulders. Eliza had a dry, quick wit that revealed itself only gradually, and a way of asking questions that made him feel, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, that someone was genuinely curious about him rather than about the title he carried. "You do not speak of Camden the way I would expect a duke to speak of his estate," she observed one morning, as she sorted through a crate of apples that had begun to soften with age, setting aside the ones still fit for the kitchen. "You speak of it the way a man speaks of a burden he loves despite himself." Nathaniel considered this for a moment, surprised, as he often was in her company, by how precisely she had captured something he had never quite managed to articulate himself. "That is very close to the truth," he admitted. "My father died rather suddenly, and I inherited debts and duties I never expected to carry so young. I love the land, and I love the people who depend on me, but I confess there are days I wonder what my life might have looked like had none of it fallen to me at all." Eliza was quiet for a moment, her hands stilling over the crate of apples. "That is not so very different from my own situation," she said finally, "though her circumstances are considerably grander than mine, of course. We are both, I think, living lives shaped by choices made before we were old enough to have any say in them." Nathaniel found himself struck, not for the first time, by how easily she understood him, how little effort their conversations required compared to the careful performances he endured each evening in the drawing-room. He did not say so aloud, though he suspected, from the small, knowing smile she offered him a moment later, that she understood that too. Their growing familiarity did not go entirely unnoticed, however, and Nathaniel became increasingly aware, as the days passed, of Charlotte's sharpening scrutiny. She began appearing at breakfast earlier than before, her eyes flicking toward him with a calculating watchfulness that had not been present during his first days at Pembroke Hall, and on more than one occasion he caught her gaze following Eliza's movements around the room with an expression that made him distinctly uneasy. The confrontation, when it came, arrived on a gray afternoon nearly 10 days into his visit, during a quiet hour when most of the household had retired to their private pursuits. Nathaniel had slipped away from a tedious card game with Lord Pembroke and several of his hunting companions, claiming a need for fresh air, and made his way toward the library, hoping for a few uninterrupted hours with a book, only to find Charlotte already waiting there, seated primly in a chair near the window, as though she had anticipated his arrival. "Your Grace," she said, rising smoothly as he entered, "I hoped we might have a moment to speak privately." "Of course," Nathaniel said, though something in her carefully composed expression put him on guard. Charlotte moved closer, her voice dropping to a confidential register. "I feel I must mention something," she said, "though I hope you will not think me unkind for raising it. I have noticed you spending a great deal of time in the company of one of our servants. Eliza, I believe her name is." Nathaniel kept his expression carefully neutral, though he felt his jaw tighten slightly. "I have spoken with her on occasion, yes," he said. "I fail to see why that should concern you." Charlotte's smile remained fixed in place, though something colder flickered behind her eyes. "I only mention it," she said, "because I would hate for you to be taken advantage of. Eliza has always been rather ambitious for a girl in her position. I would not want her to mistake ordinary kindness for something more and cause difficulties for herself or embarrassment for you." The implication in her words was clear enough, and Nathaniel felt a sharp flash of anger, though he mastered it before it could show fully on his face. "I think," he said, his tone carefully even, "that Eliza is quite capable of understanding the difference between kindness and something more, without any need for concern on your part. And I would ask that you not speak of her in such terms again, in my presence or otherwise." Charlotte's composure faltered visibly at that, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing her face before she recovered, offering a tight smile and a murmured apology that did not sound entirely sincere. "Of course, Your Grace," she said. "I only meant to be helpful. Forgive me if I have overstepped." She left the library shortly after, and Nathaniel remained alone for a long while, staring out the window at the gray afternoon, turning the exchange over in his mind. He did not doubt that Charlotte's words, however coldly delivered, would find their way back to Eliza in some form, whether through Charlotte herself or through the careful, watchful eyes of the household staff who missed very little of what passed within those walls. He was right to worry. That evening, when Eliza came to clear the tea things, her manner was subtly different, more guarded than it had been in days, and when Nathaniel attempted to catch her eye, she avoided his gaze entirely, her movements quick and businesslike as she gathered the cups and left the room without a single word exchanged between them. He found her the following morning in the courtyard, as always, but the easy warmth of previous mornings had cooled considerably, replaced by a careful distance that made his chest ache in a way he had not expected. "Eliza," he said, and she glanced up briefly before returning her attention to the crate before her, her movements stiff and deliberate. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carefully polite in a way it had not been in days, "is there something you require?" "I require nothing except to know why you are suddenly speaking to me as though we are strangers," he said, more bluntly than he intended. Eliza's hand stilled, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, staring down at the crate of vegetables as though it held the answer to a question she did not know how to voice. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Miss Charlotte spoke with me last night," she said. "She reminded me quite clearly of my place in this household and of the foolishness of forgetting it. She was not wrong to do so, Your Grace. I allowed myself to forget these past days exactly what I am and what you are and what is expected of both of us. It will not happen again." Nathaniel felt a surge of anger, not at Eliza, but at Charlotte, at Lady Pembroke, at the entire careful architecture of the household that had taught this remarkable young woman to make herself so small, so easily dismissed, in service of everyone else's comfort. "What Charlotte said to you was cruel and unfair," he said. "You owe her no obedience in the matter of who you choose to speak with, and certainly none to me. I have valued our conversations these past days more than I can easily express. I would not have you set them aside because of Charlotte's jealousy." Eliza's eyes snapped up to his at that, wide with something between surprise and alarm. "You should not say such things," she said, her voice unsteady now in a way he had not heard before. "You are here to choose a wife from among the Pembroke daughters. Whatever this is, whatever these mornings have become, it cannot lead anywhere, and I would be a fool to let myself believe otherwise. I have been a fool before in smaller ways, and I have paid for it. I do not intend to make that mistake again, especially not with a duke who will leave this house within a matter of weeks and likely never think of me again." The words landed like a blow, though Nathaniel understood, even as they struck him, that they came from genuine fear rather than any lack of feeling on her part. He was quiet for a long moment, searching for words that might undo the careful wall she had begun rebuilding between them, though he found none that felt adequate to the task. "I cannot promise you anything yet," he said finally, honestly. "I do not fully understand myself, where these feelings are leading me, or what my grandmother will say when she learns of them, or what my own sense of duty demands of me. But I can promise you that I do not think of you as a servant to be dismissed, and I never will, whatever happens between us in the weeks ahead." Eliza said nothing to that, though her eyes remained fixed on his for a long moment, something vulnerable and uncertain flickering behind her careful composure before she looked away, gathering her crate and murmuring a quiet excuse before hurrying back toward the kitchen door, leaving Nathaniel alone in the cold courtyard, his chest heavy with the weight of feelings he had not asked for and could no longer pretend did not exist. That same afternoon, a letter arrived from Camden, carried by a rider who had pushed his horse hard along the frozen roads, and Nathaniel recognized his grandmother's sharp, familiar handwriting the moment the servant placed it in his hands. He retreated to the privacy of his chamber to read it, and found, as he had feared, that her patience was beginning to wear thin. "2 weeks have now passed since your arrival at Pembroke Hall," the letter read, "and I have heard nothing from you regarding your intentions. Lord Pembroke writes to me that his daughters have been most attentive, and that Charlotte, in particular, has made every effort to secure your favor. I trust you have not forgotten the urgency of your situation, Nathaniel. The estate cannot wait indefinitely for you to make up your mind. I expect a decision before the month is out." Nathaniel set the letter down slowly, staring at the fire crackling in the hearth, feeling the weight of his grandmother's expectations pressing down on him with renewed force. He thought of Charlotte's carefully constructed conversations, of Margaret's anxious eagerness to please, of Isla's stubborn boredom, and found that none of them stirred in him anything close to what he felt in those quiet morning hours spent among crates of winter vegetables, listening to a servant girl's dry, unguarded wit and watching her laugh before she caught herself and hid it away again. He knew, with a certainty that settled heavily in his chest, that whatever choice his grandmother believed she had arranged for him, the true choice before him was far more complicated, and far more dangerous to his family's expectations, than anyone at Pembroke Hall yet understood. It was Isla who first told him about the letters. She found him 3 days later, walking alone along the frost-covered garden path in the late afternoon, having excused himself once again from an activity organized by her mother. This time, a lengthy discussion of wedding preparations that Lady Pembroke had begun orchestrating with alarming confidence, despite the fact that Nathaniel had made no formal declaration to anyone. Isla fell into step beside him without invitation, her hands tucked into the pockets of her heavy wool coat, her expression unusually serious. "You should know something, Your Grace," she said, without preamble. "My mother has written to her sister in Yorkshire. She means to send Eliza there within the fortnight, to serve as a companion to our aunt, who is old and difficult and drives away every servant sent to attend her within a matter of months." Nathaniel stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "Why would your mother do such a thing?" he asked, though he suspected, even as he asked it, that he already knew the answer. Isla's expression was flat, unimpressed by his attempt at feigned ignorance. "You know why," she said. "Charlotte has been complaining to Mother for days about the amount of time you spend with Eliza. Mother believes, not unreasonably, that removing Eliza from the house entirely will resolve the problem more efficiently than simply hoping you lose interest on your own." Nathaniel felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest, an anger unlike anything he had felt since arriving at Pembroke Hall. "And has Eliza been told of this plan?" he asked. "Not yet," Isla said, Mother means to inform her once your visit concludes, so that there is no scene to complicate matters while you remain a guest in this house. She is rather proud of the timing, actually. She mentioned it to Father just this morning as though it were a clever piece of household management. Nathaniel stood in silence for a long moment, staring out over the frost-covered garden, the full weight of what he had learned settling over him. He thought of Eliza's careful composure, her quiet acceptance of a household that valued her only for the work she performed, and felt a fierce, protective anger rise in him that surprised him with its intensity. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally, turning to study Isla's face. She shrugged, though the gesture seemed forced, covering something more genuine underneath. "Because it is unfair," she said simply. "Eliza has been kind to me since I was a child, kinder than my own sisters most days. She taught me to ride when no one else had the patience, and she never once made me feel foolish for preferring horses and books to needlework and gossip. I do not think it is right that my mother should ship her off to Yorkshire simply because Charlotte cannot bear the thought of you preferring anyone's company to her own." Nathaniel felt a fresh wave of respect for the youngest Pembroke sister, one he had not fully appreciated until this moment. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I do not yet know what I intend to do, but I will not allow this to happen without at least attempting to prevent it." Isla studied him for a long moment, something calculating in her gaze that reminded him briefly of Charlotte, though entirely without the coldness that colored her elder sister's version of the same expression. "You care for her," she said. "It is not merely idle interest. I have watched you these past 2 weeks, Your Grace, and I have never seen a man look at Charlotte, or at Margaret, the way you look at Eliza when you think no one is paying attention." Nathaniel did not deny it, though he found himself uncertain how much of his own heart he was prepared to admit aloud, even to an ally as unexpected as Isla had become. "I am not certain what I intend to do about it," he said honestly. "My grandmother expects a decision within the fortnight, and I do not yet know how to reconcile what she expects of me with what I have come to feel in these past weeks." Isla was quiet for a moment, considering this. "For what it is worth," she said finally, "I do not want to marry you either, Your Grace, and I mean that as no insult. I have no wish to be a duchess, managing households and hosting dinners and smiling politely at people I do not like. I would rather you chose Eliza than either of my sisters, if it means I am finally left in peace to pursue my own interests without my mother constantly reminding me that I am the only unmarried Pembroke daughter left." Despite the seriousness of the conversation, Nathaniel found himself laughing at that, genuinely and without restraint, the sound startling a pair of birds from the hedge beside them. "You are a remarkable young woman, Isla Pembroke," he said. "I hope, whatever comes of this, that you find whatever peace you are looking for." They parted ways shortly after, Isla returning to the house with a small, satisfied smile that suggested she had accomplished exactly what she set out to do, and Nathaniel remained alone in the garden for a long while, turning over the difficult knot of feeling and duty that had settled in his chest. He found Eliza that evening, later than usual, in the small pantry off the kitchen where she was taking inventory of preserves by candlelight, her expression tired in a way that suggested a long day had worn at her more than usual. She startled when he appeared in the doorway, glancing quickly toward the corridor behind him as though checking for observers before allowing herself to relax slightly. "Your Grace," she said, "you should not be here. If Lady Pembroke finds you in the servants' pantry at this hour, there will be no reasonable explanation I can offer." "I do not care," Nathaniel said, and something in his tone must have alerted her to the seriousness of his mood, because her expression shifted immediately, wariness replacing her earlier fatigue. "What is wrong?" she asked. Nathaniel hesitated only a moment before deciding that honesty, however difficult, was the only path forward that felt right to him. "I have learned that Lady Pembroke intends to send you to Yorkshire," he said, watching her face carefully for her reaction, "to serve as a companion to her sister, once my visit concludes." Eliza's expression flickered, surprise and something like resignation passing across her features in quick succession, though she did not seem entirely shocked by the revelation. "I had wondered how long it would be before something of this nature happened," she said quietly, setting down the jar of preserves she had been holding. Lady Pembroke has made her displeasure with our conversations quite clear these past weeks, in her own careful way. I suppose I should be grateful she did not simply dismiss me outright. The calm resignation in her voice struck Nathaniel harder than outrage would have, and he found himself crossing the small pantry to stand closer to her, though he kept a careful, respectful distance between them, aware of how easily this moment could be misconstrued should anyone discover them. "I will not allow it," he said firmly. Eliza looked up at him, something fragile and uncertain in her expression. "It is not your decision to make, Your Grace," she said, though her voice lacked the sharp conviction it usually carried. "I am not family to you, and Lady Pembroke's household is not yours to command." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "But I am the guest whose good opinion Lord Pembroke and his wife have spent weeks courting, at considerable trouble to themselves, and I do not think they will find it so easy to send you away against my expressed wishes, if I choose to make those wishes clear." Eliza studied him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. "And what happens," she asked quietly, "when your visit ends, and you return to Camden and choose one of the sisters as your grandmother has demanded? What becomes of me then, Your Grace, once your influence over this household no longer extends to my protection?" The question hung heavily in the small pantry, and Nathaniel found he had no easy answer to offer her, though the truth of what he had wanted for days now without fully allowing himself to acknowledge it, rose sharply in his chest, demanding to be spoken. "I do not intend to choose one of the sisters," he said finally, the words feeling both terrifying and inevitable as he spoke them aloud for the first time. "I have known that for some time now, Eliza, though I have been afraid to say it plainly, even to myself. Whatever my grandmother expects of me, whatever duty demands, I cannot walk into that drawing-room each evening and pretend that Charlotte's polished conversation or Margaret's anxious smiles hold any claim on my heart, when every quiet moment I have spent with you these past weeks has meant more to me than anything else that has happened since I arrived at this house." Eliza's breath caught audibly, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, staring up at him with an expression caught somewhere between hope and fear, as though she did not quite trust herself to believe what she had just heard. "You cannot mean that," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your grandmother would never accept it. Lord Pembroke would be humiliated. Charlotte would never forgive the insult, and Lady Pembroke would make certain the scandal followed you for the rest of your life. You are a duke, Your Grace. I am a servant with a distant, unacknowledged claim to gentility that means nothing to anyone who matters in society. It is not a fairy tale. It is not so simple as wanting something enough to make it happen." "I know it will not be simple," Nathaniel said. "I know there will be difficulty and gossip and very likely genuine anger from my grandmother, at least at first. But I have spent 2 years of my life doing exactly what duty demanded of me, managing debts and tenants and obligations I never asked for, and I find, for the first time since my father died, that I want something for myself, something that has nothing to do with what is expected or convenient or easy. I want to know you better, Eliza. I want to see whether what I am feeling is as real as it seems to me in these stolen mornings, without the shadow of Lady Pembroke's disapproval or Yorkshire looming over every conversation we share." Eliza was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled slightly, though whether from fear or something closer to hope, Nathaniel could not fully tell. "I do not know what to say to that," she admitted. "I have spent so many years teaching myself not to want things I cannot have, that I hardly know how to respond when someone offers me the possibility of wanting them anyway." "Then do not answer tonight," Nathaniel said gently. "Only know that I meant what I said, and that I intend to speak with Lord Pembroke and Lady Pembroke both, before this visit concludes, and make it clear that whatever plans they have made regarding Yorkshire will not proceed while I have any influence to prevent it." Eliza nodded slowly, though the uncertainty had not entirely left her expression, and Nathaniel, aware of how much time had already passed and how great the risk of discovery had grown, forced himself to step back, to offer a formal, careful bow that felt absurdly out of place given the intimacy of what had just passed between them, before slipping quietly from the pantry and back toward the main house, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination he had not felt in years. He did not yet know how he would manage the difficult conversations that lay ahead, with Lord Pembroke, with Lady Pembroke, with his own grandmother, whose letters had grown sharper with each passing week. But he knew, walking alone through the darkened corridors of Pembroke Hall, that he could no longer pretend the choice before him was the simple one his grandmother had imagined when she sent him here, and that whatever came next, he was no longer willing to let fear of scandal or duty stand between himself and the quiet, remarkable young woman who had, without any intention of doing so, become the truest thing he had encountered since arriving at this house. The confrontation with Lord Pembroke came sooner than Nathaniel had planned, forced by circumstances he had not anticipated. 2 mornings after his conversation with Eliza in the pantry, Nathaniel rose before dawn as had become his habit, intending to speak with her once more before the household stirred, only to find the kitchen courtyard empty, the crates of winter vegetables untouched, the fire in the small outdoor stove unlit. A young kitchen maid, hurrying past with an armload of linens, informed him when pressed that Eliza had been called to Lady Pembroke's private sitting room at first light, and had not yet emerged. Nathaniel felt a cold certainty settle over him, and he made his way immediately toward the family wing of the house, arriving at Lady Pembroke's sitting room just as the door opened and Eliza stepped out, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed as though she had been fighting back tears. She startled at the sight of him, glancing quickly over her shoulder toward the still-open door, before hurrying past him without a word, disappearing down the corridor before he could stop her. Lady Pembroke stood in the doorway of her sitting room, her expression cool and composed, watching Nathaniel with an assessing gaze that made no effort to hide its calculation. "Your Grace," she said, "I did not expect you to be about so early." "What did you say to her?" Nathaniel asked, dispensing entirely with the pleasantries that had governed every interaction between them since his arrival. Lady Pembroke's eyebrows rose slightly at his tone, though she did not seem entirely surprised by it. "I informed her of the arrangements I have made for her future," she said. "My sister in Yorkshire is in need of a companion, and Eliza has grown rather too comfortable in this household of late. It is time she understood her position more clearly." Nathaniel felt his temper, carefully controlled through weeks of polite performance, finally begin to slip its restraints entirely. "She understands her position perfectly well," he said, his voice hard. "It is you and your household who seem determined to make that position as painful and diminished as possible, for reasons that have nothing to do with her conduct and everything to do with your daughter's jealousy." Lady Pembroke's composure cracked slightly at that, color rising in her cheeks. "You forget yourself, Your Grace," she said sharply. "This is my household, and Eliza is my ward, whatever distant claim she has on our name. I will manage her future as I see fit, and I would remind you that your continued attention toward her only makes her situation more precarious, not less. If you truly cared for her welfare, you would leave well enough alone and allow her to make a respectable life for herself elsewhere, rather than encouraging fantasies that can only end in humiliation for her, whatever your intentions might be." The words struck harder than Nathaniel wanted to admit, carrying a grain of uncomfortable truth beneath their sharp delivery, and he stood in silence for a moment, forcing himself to master his anger before he spoke again. "I intend to speak with Lord Pembroke about this matter directly," he said finally. "And I would ask that you delay any arrangements regarding Yorkshire until that conversation has taken place." Lady Pembroke studied him for a long moment, something calculating shifting behind her eyes, and Nathaniel had the distinct impression that she was recalculating some private arithmetic regarding his intentions, his usefulness to her family's ambitions, and the danger he now posed to plans she had clearly considered already settled. "Very well, Your Grace," she said finally, her tone carefully neutral once more. "I will delay the arrangements for now. But I would caution you against pursuing whatever notion has taken hold of you regarding that girl. It will bring nothing but difficulty to her, to you, and to this family's relationship with yours." Think carefully before you act rashly on feelings that will not survive contact with the realities of your position. She withdrew into her sitting room without waiting for a response, and Nathaniel stood alone in the corridor, the weight of the confrontation settling heavily over him, uncertain whether he had won any real reprieve or merely delayed an inevitable conflict. He found Lord Pembroke that same afternoon, closeted in his study with a stack of correspondence and a glass of brandy despite the early hour, and requested a private conversation with a formality that made the older man's expression shift immediately from genial welcome to wary attention. "Your Grace," Pembroke said, gesturing him toward a chair. "I confess I had hoped our next conversation might concern happier matters. Charlotte has spoken of little else these past days but the possibility of your affections settling in her direction." Nathaniel remained standing, choosing his words with careful deliberation. "I regret that I must disappoint you on that account, Lord Pembroke," he said. "I have come to understand, over these past weeks, that my affections have settled elsewhere entirely, and I felt it only honest to inform you directly, rather than allow the matter to continue unresolved." Pembroke's expression shifted through several stages of confusion before settling into something wary and uncertain. "I do not understand, Your Grace," he said slowly. "You have shown every courtesy to my daughters. Charlotte, in particular, believed matters were progressing quite favorably." "I have shown courtesy because courtesy costs nothing and causes no harm," Nathaniel said. "But I cannot, in good conscience, allow this visit to continue under false pretenses. My feelings, Lord Pembroke, have settled on Eliza." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Nathaniel wondered whether Pembroke had fully understood him, until the older man's face darkened with a mixture of confusion and dawning alarm. "Eliza," he repeated, as though testing the name for some hidden meaning. "My wife's ward, the servant." "She is your cousin's daughter," Nathaniel said evenly, "and a woman of considerable intelligence, kindness, and character, whatever position your household has assigned her. I understand this is not the arrangement my grandmother envisioned when she sent me here, and I understand it may cause difficulty between our families. But I did not think it right to continue accepting your hospitality, or allowing Charlotte to hope for an outcome I no longer intend to provide, without informing you directly of where my true feelings lie." Pembroke set down his glass with a sharp clink, rising from his chair, his earlier geniality replaced entirely by something colder and more calculating. "This is madness, Your Grace," he said. "Your grandmother will never accept such a match. You would be throwing away everything, your family's standing, your position in society, for a girl with no fortune, no connections worth mentioning, and no claim to gentility beyond a distant, unacknowledged bloodline that means nothing to anyone who matters. Think of what you would be sacrificing." "I have thought of little else these past weeks," Nathaniel said quietly, "and I find that whatever I might be sacrificing in the eyes of society matters considerably less to me than the prospect of spending my life with a woman I do not truly know or care for, simply because it would be convenient for everyone but myself." Pembroke's jaw tightened, and for a moment Nathaniel thought the older man might resort to outright anger, though he mastered himself with visible effort, running a hand through his graying hair as he sank back into his chair. "Charlotte will be devastated," he said finally, more quietly than before, "and I confess I do not know how I will explain this to your grandmother when she inevitably writes to demand an accounting of your decision." "That," Nathaniel said, "is a conversation I intend to have with her myself, directly, once matters here are settled. I do not ask you to be pleased by this outcome, Lord Pembroke, only to understand that my decision is made, and that I would ask you not to punish Eliza for feelings she did not ask for, and has, in fact, actively discouraged at every turn out of concern for exactly this kind of difficulty." Pembroke said nothing further, staring into the fire with an expression Nathaniel could not fully read, and after a long, uncomfortable silence, Nathaniel excused himself, leaving the study with the distinct sense that the true difficulty was only beginning. He was not wrong. Word of the confrontation spread through the household with startling speed, and by the time Nathaniel made his way toward the drawing room that evening, he found Charlotte waiting for him alone, her earlier polished composure entirely abandoned, her eyes red-rimmed and furious. "How dare you," she said, before he had even fully entered the room. "3 weeks, Your Grace. 3 weeks I have spent making conversation, arranging activities, presenting myself exactly as I was raised to present myself, all because my father assured me you would choose sensibly, choose appropriately, and instead you have made a fool of me over a servant who pours your tea." Nathaniel felt genuine sympathy beneath his frustration, understanding, even as her anger lashed at him, that Charlotte had indeed been raised to believe that performing correctly, accomplishing the expected tasks with sufficient skill, would earn her the outcome she had been promised since childhood, and that his refusal represented not merely personal rejection, but a fundamental failure of a system she had trusted completely. "I am sorry for the disappointment this causes you, Charlotte," he said honestly. "You have done nothing wrong, and I do not doubt you would make an excellent duchess for a man whose heart you had genuinely captured. I simply am not that man, and I would have done you a far greater disservice by pretending otherwise for the sake of convenience." Charlotte's fury did not soften at his words, if anything hardening further, her eyes narrowing with something sharp and dangerous. "You think this ends quietly," she said. "You think you can simply announce your preference for a servant and walk away untouched by consequence, while the rest of us absorb the humiliation. I promise you, Your Grace, this will not be so easily managed as you seem to believe." She left the room before he could respond, and Nathaniel stood alone in the drawing room, the fire crackling in the hearth, an uneasy premonition settling over him that Charlotte's parting words carried more weight than simple wounded pride. He did not have to wait long to discover what she meant. 2 days later, a letter arrived from his grandmother, its tone sharper and more furious than any correspondence he had yet received from her, informing him that word of his intentions had somehow already reached her in Camden, carried, he suspected, by a writer dispatched at Charlotte's own urging, and demanding that he return home immediately to explain himself before he brought irreversible scandal upon the family name. Nathaniel read the letter twice, his hands unsteady, understanding with growing dread that the quiet, careful courtship he had hoped to build with Eliza, away from the sharp eyes of society, had already been thrown into the harshest possible light, and that whatever peace remained for them to find together would have to be fought for, openly and without protection, far sooner than he had ever intended. The Dowager Duchess Beatrix arrived at Pembroke Hall 4 days later, her carriage rolling up the frozen drive with the unmistakable air of a woman who had traveled a great distance specifically to settle a matter she considered unforgivably mishandled. Nathaniel watched from an upstairs window as she emerged, wrapped in dark furs, her expression severe even at a distance, and felt his stomach tighten with a dread he had not experienced since childhood, when summons to her presence had usually preceded a lecture he would remember for weeks afterward. She wasted no time with pleasantries once she was shown into the small parlor where Nathaniel waited for her, dismissing the offer of tea with an impatient wave of her hand, and fixing him with a stare sharp enough to make him feel, despite his 28 years and his ducal title, very much like the boy who had once broken a prized vase and tried unsuccessfully to hide the pieces. "Explain yourself," she said, without preamble. Nathaniel drew a steadying breath and told her everything, plainly and without apology, of the weeks he had spent at Pembroke Hall, of Charlotte's carefully performed courtship and Margaret's anxious eagerness and Isla's stubborn indifference, and of the quiet mornings spent in a kitchen courtyard that had, without his intending it, become the truest and most important hours of his entire visit. He spoke of Eliza's intelligence, her dry wit, her quiet dignity in the face of a household that valued her only for her labor, and of the certainty that had grown in him, day by day, that whatever his grandmother had hoped to arrange, his heart had settled on someone entirely unexpected. The Duchess listened in silence throughout, her expression giving away nothing, and when he finished, she remained quiet for a long moment, studying him with an intensity that made him feel thoroughly examined and found wanting. "A servant," she said finally, her voice flat with disbelief. "You would throw away everything I have worked to preserve for this family, for a servant girl with no dowry and no name worth mentioning." "She is Lord Pembroke's own cousin's daughter," Nathaniel said. "Her blood is as good as Charlotte's or Margaret's or Isla's, whatever position circumstance has forced upon her. Blood that no one acknowledges is worth nothing in society's eyes," the Duchess snapped. "You know this as well as I do." "What will people say, Nathaniel, when they learn the Duke of Camden abandoned 3 eligible daughters of good family to marry a servant who poured his tea? You will be the subject of every drawing-room's amusement for a full season, and the scandal will follow you, and any children you might have, for years to come." "I know it will not be easy," Nathaniel said, holding her gaze steadily despite the familiar weight of her disapproval pressing down on him. "But I have spent 2 years doing everything you and duty demanded of me, grandmother. I managed the debts. I secured the tenants. I traveled here, at your insistence, to choose a wife from among 3 sisters I had never met, as though marriage were nothing more than another entry to balance in the estate's ledgers. I have done my duty faithfully, and I will continue to do it in every matter that concerns the running of Camden and the welfare of the people who depend on us. But I will not sacrifice my own heart for the sake of appearances, not when I have finally found someone who makes me want to be a better man than duty alone has ever managed to make me." The Duchess's expression flickered, something almost like surprise passing behind her sharp eyes, though she recovered quickly, her jaw setting with familiar stubbornness. "You are certain of this," she said, "not merely infatuated with a pretty face and a novelty of circumstance, but certain." "I am certain," Nathaniel said, and found, as he spoke the words, that he had never been more certain of anything in his life. The Duchess studied him for a long moment longer, and then, to his considerable surprise, something in her severe expression softened, just slightly, a shadow of memory passing across her features that Nathaniel could not quite interpret. "Your grandfather was a second son," she said finally, her voice quieter than before. "Did you know that? He was never meant to inherit anything at all. I married him against my own family's wishes, when I was young and foolish enough to believe love mattered more than sense. It was only later, when his elder brother died without issue, that circumstance made a duchess of me after all, though I would have made the same choice even had that never happened. I have perhaps forgotten, in the years since, how it felt to want something the world insisted I should not want." Nathaniel said nothing, sensing that his grandmother was not finished, that some old, private grief or memory had risen unexpectedly to the surface, softening, however briefly, the sternness she wore like armor. "I will meet this Eliza," she said finally, her tone brisk once more, though something in it had genuinely shifted. "Before I decide whether to support this madness or forbid it entirely, I will judge her character for myself. Arrange it." Nathaniel agreed immediately, relief and apprehension warring in his chest in equal measure, and that evening, at a dinner arranged with careful formality, he did something no one in the household had expected, requesting that Eliza be seated at the table as a guest rather than serving it, a request that landed over the assembled company like a thrown stone into still water. Lord and Lady Pembroke exchanged a look of visible alarm. Charlotte's face went white and then red with fury. Margaret stared down at her plate in evident discomfort, and only Isla, seated near the end of the table, offered a small, satisfied smile at the unfolding scene. Eliza herself, summoned from the kitchen and informed of the arrangement only minutes before the meal began, arrived pale and visibly shaken, dressed in her plain gray uniform, entirely unprepared for the role she had been thrust into. "Your Grace," she whispered to Nathaniel as she was shown to the empty seat beside him, "this is a terrible mistake. Everyone is staring." "Let them stare," Nathaniel said quietly, reaching to press her trembling hand briefly beneath the table's edge, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by the Duchess, seated directly across from them, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The meal proceeded in an atmosphere of excruciating tension, Lady Pembroke maintaining a brittle, forced cheerfulness that fooled no one, Lord Pembroke drinking rather more wine than usual, and Charlotte alternating between icy silence and pointed remarks, aimed just close enough to Eliza to wound without quite crossing into outright rudeness, that a duke's grandmother might openly rebuke. It was the Duchess herself who finally addressed Eliza directly, midway through the second course, her voice carrying easily across the table and silencing the strained conversation immediately. "Tell me about yourself, girl," she said, her tone imperious but not unkind. "My grandson seems to believe you possess qualities worth abandoning 3 eligible marriages for. I would like to judge that claim for myself." Eliza's hands trembled slightly as she set down her fork, but when she spoke, her voice, though quiet, carried a steadiness that Nathaniel recognized from their private conversations, the same quiet dignity that had first drawn his attention weeks earlier. "I do not know that I possess any particular qualities worth remarking on, Your Grace," she said. "I have spent most of my life managing a household that was never truly mine, learning to make myself useful in whatever way was required, and trying to hold on to some sense of who I am despite circumstances that have often suggested I should not expect very much for myself. I did not seek your grandson's attention, and I have in fact discouraged it at every opportunity, out of concern for exactly the difficulty this dinner represents. But I have found, over these past weeks, that I cannot help the way I have come to care for him, however impractical and however certain I am that it will cause hardship for us both." The Duchess listened to this with an unreadable expression, and when Eliza finished, a long silence stretched over the table, broken only by the soft clink of cutlery as Charlotte, unable to contain herself further, set down her utensils with considerably more force than necessary. "This is absurd," she said, her voice rising despite her mother's warning glance. "You cannot seriously be considering allowing this, Your Grace. She is a servant. She pours the tea. She has no place at this table, let alone any claim on a duke's affections." The Duchess turned her sharp gaze toward Charlotte, and something in her expression made the younger woman's angry momentum falter, though she did not fully retreat. "I will decide for myself what claims are legitimate in this house, girl," the Duchess said, her voice carrying the full weight of decades spent commanding rooms far grander than this one. "And I find, having heard her speak, that I understand rather better than you seem to, exactly what my grandson sees in her." Charlotte's face drained of color, and she rose abruptly from the table, murmuring something incoherent about a headache before fleeing the room entirely, her mother hurrying after her with an expression of mortified apology directed at the Duchess as she went. The remainder of the dinner passed in considerably more subdued fashion, Lord Pembroke attempting valiantly to salvage some semblance of normal conversation, while Margaret sat in uncomfortable silence and Isla, for her part, seemed to be enjoying the unfolding drama a great deal more than propriety strictly allowed. Later that evening, once the household had finally retired and the worst of the immediate tension had eased, the Duchess summoned Nathaniel to a private conversation in the guest chamber she had been given, and studied him for a long moment before speaking. "She has spine," the Duchess said finally, "and sense, which is rarer still in young women who have been given every reason to expect nothing from the world. I will not pretend this will be easy, Nathaniel. Society will talk. Some doors may close to you at least for a time. But I find, having met her, that I no longer have the heart to forbid what you have already decided in your own mind regardless of my blessing. Marry her if that is truly what you want. I will manage whatever difficulty arises from it, as I have managed every other difficulty this family has faced." Nathaniel felt a wave of relief and gratitude so profound it nearly unsteadied him, and he crossed the room to embrace his grandmother, an act of open affection rare enough between them that she stiffened in surprise before, after a moment, allowing herself to return the gesture, however briefly. "Thank you, grandmother," he said. "Do not thank me yet," she said, though her tone had softened considerably. "Thank me once you have survived the wedding and the season that follows it, and every sharp-tongued woman in London who will have opinions about a duke marrying his tea server. This will not be the easy path, Nathaniel. But I suspect, having watched you these past hours, that you have already decided it is the right one regardless. He had, and as he made his way back through the darkened house toward his own chamber that night, his heart lighter than it had been in years, he found himself thinking not of the difficulties that lay ahead, of Charlotte's fury or society's judgment, or the long, uncertain road toward making Eliza truly his, but of the quiet courage she had shown at that dinner table, speaking her truth before a room full of people who had every reason to dismiss her, and finding in himself nothing but certainty that whatever came next, he wanted to face it beside her. Charlotte's final attempt to alter the course of events came 3 days later, on the morning Nathaniel had planned to formally request Lord Pembroke's blessing for Eliza's hand, though not in the manner anyone might have predicted. He found Eliza in the garden that morning, walking alone along the frost-covered paths in the pale early light, and something in her expression, tight and anxious in a way he had not seen since the earliest days of their acquaintance, told him immediately that something had gone wrong. "What is it?" he asked, closing the distance between them quickly. Eliza held out a folded piece of paper, her hand trembling slightly. "Charlotte gave this to me this morning," she said. "She said I should read it carefully before allowing myself to believe any promises you might make." Nathaniel took the paper and unfolded it, reading quickly, his jaw tightening with each line. It was a letter, purportedly copied from correspondence between his grandmother and a distant cousin, describing in cold, calculating detail a plan to have the marriage quietly annulled, once sufficient time had passed for the scandal to fade, restoring Nathaniel to the marriage market with his reputation intact, and Eliza quietly pensioned off to some distant corner of the country, never to trouble the family again. "This is forged," Nathaniel said immediately, though he could see, from the careful way the letter had been constructed, mimicking his grandmother's phrasing and concerns closely enough to be genuinely alarming to someone unfamiliar with her true intentions, exactly why Charlotte had chosen this particular method of sabotage. "My grandmother has already given her blessing, freely, and without any such condition. I do not know where Charlotte obtained the material to construct something so convincing, but I promise you, on my honor, that not a word of it is true." Eliza studied his face for a long moment, searching, he suspected, for any flicker of deception, before her shoulders sagged with visible relief, though the fear did not entirely leave her eyes. "I wanted to believe that," she said. "But I have spent so many years being told, in careful, indirect ways, that I should not expect too much from the world, that it was easier, for a moment, to believe the worst than to risk trusting fully in something that seemed too good to be real." Nathaniel took her hands gently in his own, the letter crumpled between their palms. "I understand why you would fear it," he said. "But I intend to prove to you, every day for the rest of our lives, that this is not too good to be real, that it is simply what you deserve, and what I want more than anything else I have ever wanted." They confronted Charlotte together that same morning, finding her in the small sitting room where she had retreated since her humiliation at the dinner table days earlier. And though she initially denied any involvement in the forged letter, her composure cracked quickly under the weight of Nathaniel's steady, unyielding gaze, and she finally admitted, with tears of frustration and shame, that she had written it herself, copying phrases from letters she had glimpsed during his grandmother's brief stay. Desperate to find some way, any way, to prevent the marriage she still believed represented a fundamental betrayal of everything she had been promised. "I am sorry," she said finally, her earlier fury entirely spent, replaced by something more genuinely regretful. "I do not know what I hoped to accomplish. I think, somewhere in the midst of my anger, I convinced myself that if I could not have what I wanted, I could at least prevent someone else from having it either. It was cruel, and I am ashamed of it." Nathaniel, though he did not entirely forgive the deception, found himself unable to sustain his anger fully in the face of her genuine remorse, understanding, as he had from the beginning, that Charlotte's actions stemmed from a lifetime of being taught that her worth depended entirely on securing an advantageous marriage, a lesson she had absorbed so thoroughly that watching it slip away had felt, to her, like losing everything. "I hope," he said finally, "that you find in time a life that brings you genuine happiness, Charlotte, one built on something more lasting than the expectations others have placed upon you. You are clever and capable of a great deal more than you have perhaps been permitted to imagine for yourself." Charlotte said nothing to that, though something in her expression suggested his words had landed more deeply than she wished to show, and Nathaniel and Eliza left her alone in the sitting room, the matter, at last, fully resolved. The proposal itself, when it finally came, happened not with any grand ceremony, but in the same quiet kitchen courtyard where their connection had first taken root, among crates of winter vegetables and the familiar smell of wood smoke drifting from the kitchen chimney. Nathaniel had planned, in the days leading up to it, to arrange something more befitting a duke, a formal setting, perhaps, or an elegant ring presented with appropriate ceremony. But standing there in the pale morning light, watching Eliza sort through a crate of apples with the same practiced efficiency she had shown the very first time he saw her working in that courtyard, he found he could not wait a moment longer. "I do not have a ring prepared yet," he said, drawing her attention from her work. "My grandmother is arranging for one to be sent from Camden, along with several rather stern instructions about proper procedure that I fully intend to ignore. But I find I cannot wait for propriety to catch up with what my heart has already decided. Eliza, will you marry me?" Eliza stared at him for a long moment, apples forgotten in her hands, tears gathering in her eyes, though a wide, genuine smile broke across her face, the same unguarded expression he had glimpsed that very first morning before she caught herself and hid it away. "Yes," she said, setting down the apples and closing the distance between them. "Yes, Nathaniel, 1,000 times yes." The wedding, when it finally took place some months later, was held not in London, where society's sharpest tongues would have made a spectacle of every detail, but at Camden itself, in a small chapel on the estate grounds, attended by tenants and household staff who had known and respected Eliza's quiet kindness since she first arrived to take up residence there as Nathaniel's betrothed. The Duchess, true to her word, had managed the difficulty of society's opinion with the same formidable determination she brought to every challenge. And though there had indeed been whispers and raised eyebrows in certain drawing rooms that season, the marriage of the Duke of Camden to a woman of genuine character and quiet strength had, by the time the wedding took place, become rather more a subject of romantic fascination than scandal. The kind of story that softened even the hardest hearts among the gossiping matrons of London society. Lord and Lady Pembroke attended, along with all 3 of their daughters, Charlotte considerably subdued but genuinely gracious in her congratulations. Having spent the intervening months, Nathaniel later learned, cultivating a promising acquaintance with a young baronet who seemed to appreciate her sharp wit far more than she had expected anyone to. Margaret, radiant with happiness of her own, arrived on the arm of the young gentleman Nathaniel had noticed her attention drawn to during that first hunting picnic, their engagement announced only weeks earlier. And Isla, true to her word, had negotiated with her father a delay in any marriage plans of her own, instead pursuing, with her father's reluctant but genuine support, a course of study that would allow her to eventually manage the estate's breeding stables herself, a prospect that brought her more genuine joy than any wedding ever could have. Standing at the altar, watching Eliza walk toward him in a simple gown of pale blue that suited her far better than any elaborate finery might have, Nathaniel felt the full weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. The reluctant journey to Pembroke Hall, the careful performances of the drawing room, the quiet mornings in the kitchen courtyard, the fear and courage it had taken for both of them to trust in something so far outside the boundaries either of them had been taught to expect for their lives. "I love you," he whispered to her, as she took her place beside him before the assembled guests, "and I promise to spend every day proving that this was never too good to be true." Eliza's answering smile held none of the careful composure she had once worn like armor against a world that had taught her to expect very little, only the bright, unguarded warmth he had glimpsed that first morning in the courtyard, and he understood, watching it, that he had found in her exactly what his grandmother's careful arrangements had never intended to offer him, something real, something chosen freely rather than assigned by duty, and something he intended to treasure for the rest of his life. 5 years later, Camden looked nothing like the cold, debt-heavy estate Nathaniel had inherited in his father's sudden absence. The fields, once neglected, now stretched green and well tended under a steward Eliza herself had helped select, a woman other landowners had initially scoffed at hiring, until her careful management of the accounts silenced every doubt within a single harvest season. The tenants who had once eyed their young, distracted duke with quiet worry now greeted him, and more often his duchess, with genuine warmth whenever they passed through the villages that bordered the estate. Eliza had brought to Camden the same quiet efficiency she had once brought to a servant's tray of teacups, though now it served an entirely different purpose, reorganizing the household's finances, establishing a small school for the children of tenant farmers, and quietly ensuring that no young woman working within the walls of Camden Hall would ever be made to feel as small or as easily dismissed as she once had at Pembroke Hall. She remembered too well what it felt like to be seen only for one's usefulness, and she had built, in the years since her marriage, a household where every servant, from the newest kitchen maid to the longest-serving butler, was treated with the same respect Nathaniel had once shown her over crates of winter vegetables. Their days were not without difficulty. The first 2 years of their marriage had tested them both in ways neither had fully anticipated, London society's lingering skepticism, the awkwardness of Eliza learning to navigate a world of formal dinners and diplomatic correspondence she had never been trained for, and the occasional sharp comment from a visiting dignitary who still could not quite believe a duke had married his wife's tea server. But Eliza had met each challenge with the same steady determination she brought to everything, and Nathaniel had stood beside her through every difficult evening, every whispered comment, every moment of doubt, until gradually the whispers faded into something closer to admiration, and the Duchess of Camden became known throughout the county and increasingly beyond it, not for the unusual circumstances of her marriage, but for the genuine warmth and intelligence she brought to every room she entered. Isla visited often, having become, as she had hoped, one of the finest horse breeders in the county, her stables producing animals sought after by families far grander than the Pembrokes had ever been. She arrived at Camden each spring smelling of hay and leather, entirely unbothered by the formal expectations of ducal visits, and spent long afternoons with Eliza discussing everything from horse pedigrees to the management of household accounts, their friendship, forged in the difficult days at Pembroke Hall, having only deepened with time. Charlotte, too, had found her way to a happiness Nathaniel had once doubted she would ever discover, her marriage to the young baronet proving, against all expectation, a genuine partnership built on a shared sharpness of wit that had once made her such formidable company in the drawing-room. She and Eliza had never become close, exactly, the wounds of that difficult courtship too deep to fully heal into easy friendship, but a careful, respectful peace had settled between them over the years, and Charlotte's letters, when they arrived, carried none of the bitterness that had once colored every interaction between them. Margaret's life had unfolded quietly and happily on a modest estate 2 counties away, her gentle nature finding its match in a husband who valued her softness, rather than expecting her to perform accomplishments she had never truly enjoyed. She and Eliza exchanged letters regularly, filled with news of children and gardens and the small, ordinary joys neither of them had been entirely certain, in their younger years, they would be permitted to claim for themselves. On a warm evening in early summer, 5 years to the season since Nathaniel had first arrived at Pembroke Hall with a cracked carriage wheel, and a heart entirely unprepared for what awaited him there, he found Eliza in the garden at Camden, seated on a low stone bench near the roses she had planted herself, their young daughter asleep in her arms. Having finally succumbed to exhaustion after an afternoon spent chasing butterflies across the lawn, with an energy that had left both her parents laughing helplessly by the end of it, he sat down beside her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, content simply to watch the last light of evening settle golden over the gardens, the same gardens where Eliza had once told him, all those years ago, that she rarely had time to sit and enjoy the roses that bloomed along the south wall. Do you ever think of it, he asked finally, quietly, that first tea tray, and how close I came to never noticing you at all? Eliza smiled, glancing down at their sleeping daughter before turning her gaze back to him, her eyes as warm and steady as they had been that very first evening, when he had thanked her for pouring his tea and watched surprise flicker across her careful composure. I think of it often, she said, though I have come to believe you would have noticed me eventually, however carefully I tried to remain invisible. You were never very good at looking away from the things that truly mattered, even when duty told you to look elsewhere. Nathaniel laughed softly at that, reaching to take her hand, their fingers lacing together with the easy familiarity of 5 years spent building a life neither of them had once believed possible. Perhaps not, he admitted, though I confess I am endlessly grateful that duty failed so thoroughly that day to keep my attention where it was meant to be. They sat together as the evening deepened around them, the estate quiet and peaceful in the gathering dusk, their daughter stirring softly in her sleep, and Nathaniel found himself thinking, not for the first time, that whatever his grandmother had once believed she was arranging when she sent him to Pembroke Hall to choose between 3 carefully presented sisters, the true gift of that difficult journey had never been a choice at all, but a discovery, quiet and unexpected. Waiting for him in a courtyard full of winter vegetables, in the warm brown eyes and steady hands of a woman the world had taught to make herself small, and who had, in loving him freely and without expectation, taught him in turn exactly what it meant to build a life worth choosing, every single day, rather than simply accepting the one duty alone had prepared for him.